Welcome and thank you so much for coming to the third annual Elizabeth Dafoe Memorial Lecture. If you haven't already, please help yourself to snacks or top up if you've already had something. My name is Donna Breivogel. I'm Associate Director of Libraries here at the University of Manitoba. The Elizabeth Dafoe Memorial Lecture Series was started 3 years ago to honor Elizabeth Dafoe. She started to work at the University of Manitoba Libraries in 1925, and she was Chief Librarian here from 1937 until her death in 1960. Then in 1961, this building, the Elizabeth Dafoe Library, was named after her. Elizabeth Dafoe was born in Montreal in the year 1900, and she moved to Winnipeg as an infant. Her father was J.W. Dafoe, the famous editor of the Winnipeg Free Press. And Elizabeth Dafoe lived in Winnipeg her entire life, except for one memorable year of studies in New York in 1924, when she attended the library school of the New York Public Library. Elizabeth Dafoe loved poetry and books. She loved travel. She loved her little blue sports car, the family cottage on Lake Winnipeg. She loved her nieces and nephews. She loved libraries and the life of the mind. And I know she absolutely would love the presentation that we're about to enjoy this afternoon on ancient Alexandria, the great library, and Hypatia. And I have to add, it's kind of hard to imagine a topic that's more perfect for October, which is also Canadian Library Month and Women's History Month. So that kind of magically came together. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Don McCarthy, Dean Emeritus of the University of Manitoba Faculty of Arts and recently retired member of the Philosophy Department. Dr. McCarthy started his university studies in Washington, D.C., later studying at the Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto and receiving his Ph.D. in medieval philosophy from the University of Toronto. He taught at Boston College before joining the University of Manitoba, where he has the distinction of being the university's very first Dean of Arts, named to that position in 1970 when the Faculty of Arts and Science separated. Dr. McCarthy has a reputation, I know, as a wonderfully entertaining teacher, and I know we're going to see that in action today.
Before I get going, I should mention, I hope everybody has a ballpoint and starts making corrections as you go along through the paper there. There are a couple of, well, more than a couple of slips, and I'll try to, I got the dates of Alexandria wrong, that's the start. Did that 3 times. It's 331, not 431. But anyway, let's hope not too many. I'd like to begin by well, I'll give a little introduction and then look at my map. First thing I want to make clear before it becomes self-evident, I'm not an expert on Alexandria as such, by no means. But in my teaching over the 54 years of teaching and the research, most of which was directed towards the teaching, Alexandria has come up a number of times. First, my main teaching has been on either the writings of Plato and Aristotle or the writings of medievals such as Thomas Aquinas. And all the writings of Aristotle and Plato often trace their ideas through later history. And the channels through which the ideas passed were often religious ones, and medieval theologians and earlier ones. And in tracing the history, Alexandria becomes extremely important. The several teachers there will influence all of Western Christianity for all its history, and it became interesting to me because I was especially interested in how Christianity produced syntheses of doctrine using Greek ideas, and I'll mention a couple as we go along. I also taught a couple of courses for the religion department on the history of anti-Semitism within Christianity, and of course Alexandria came up in that history. So I come to Alexandria, some parts I've emphasized, but most of it is beyond where I usually work, and I've relied on secondary sources there. The first thing I want to mention, and I have that put down on the paper, I'll bear as a copy, of the three groups to keep in mind when you're looking at the Alexandria. First, under Alexander himself, or the Macedonians, and then the Ptolemaic rulers. Ptolemy the First was one of his generals who took over that area. After the Ptolemaic dynasty, from 304 BCE to 30 BCE, I mentioned the main ones there, and that's when the Romans conquered it and take over from 30 BCE on. And in 640 of the CE, the Muslim Arabs take over, and they basically rule it until the Ottoman Turks conquer it. I'd like to use the map there. I hope I can. Just to point out a couple things. I'll see if I can move further here. Just helps a little bit to place it. Alexandria is spelled D-R-I-A. Oh, brilliant. Anyway, Alexandria came down, he crossed over, came down through Palestine, took a couple of years, got here in 332, and went over and picked out this spot to build a city on. It just, I think about 10 or 12 miles to the west of the last exit of the Nile River. This particular one no longer exists. That one's still there. This one is now disappeared. And we'll look at better maps as we go along. I just mention a couple things. We'll deal with the monks and monasteries, and they don't have a very good record in the period we're dealing with, but they do begin here in Syria. Some of the monks right along here, then St. Anthony over here, and this group in Sketis, or there's one right below it there, and they're the ones that come in and cause some of the trouble. They have a bad reputation, but eventually in the Middle Ages play a big role in the saving of books, not of this kind. Can you hear me out here? Or do you need a loudspeaker? Can't hear anything. Okay. I'll try it. It's a little easier to work over here. Anyway, dealing first of all with the next picture. This brings a little closer into Alexandria, the environs. Alexandria was built on an isthmus, a very long one, between the Mediterranean Sea and the lake here. And it's very, very narrow. And it's useful, and the island out there is now connected with the mainland here. You see the canals over down to the Nile, over here, and there's another one down there. They depend on those to get around and get into further into Egypt. Here's a picture of the Alexandria. It was laid out by a grid, apparently by Alexander himself. And the two main streets across there, this is pretty clear now in modern times. They're pretty clear which one it was. Some of the things are just not very well located. Next to the island off there, this had just the Hypatia connected there, about 1,300 yards, I guess. And this connection slowly filled in, so it's very wide now with sand going into the water. This is the famous lighthouse. I'll show you a picture of how it's imagined to look. So this is the eastern harbor, and that's the western harbor. The palace area is up in this area in here. And this over into this actually, this canal up through there. This is the Jewish area, very important in the history of a very large Jewish district there. Most of the things are not located today, but the Kaisarion and the here, we know the location, not because they found the foundations, I don't think they found them yet, but because in front of the building, there were placed two obelisks that were there, and it was just because they're immediately in front of the building, and they stood into the 19th century. One was standing, one was lying down. In the 19th century, so there are even photographs and drawings. We know exactly where that building was, and that comes up in our story very prominently. The two obelisks were moved to the late 19th century, one to London, where it's called the Cleopatra's Needle, and the other one to New York City, Central Park, with gifts of the Egyptians to those countries. So this is one of our main buildings that's very important, built by Cleopatra, and it later becomes a Christian cathedral. This is the Serapeum down here, and that's still a ruin now, and then here with the ruin out there. So that's roughly an idea of a picture of that street drawing of it. But the Serapeum down there and the Alexandria up there. I might mention that there may be things you'll learn today, but for all of you, you may be learning new pronunciations of Greek names. Something you've never heard of before. Okay, and let's dealt first of all with the museum and the great library. The location, exact location is not clear. It was in the palace area, but they've never found the foundations of them. It was modeled after the Lyceum of Aristotle in Athens. Theophrastus took over after Aristotle, and one of his friends and students was Demetrius, who goes to Alexandria and plays a big role in the setting up of the museum and the library. This was like an institute for advanced studies, the museum. It attracted and produced enormous number of research scholars in many fields, such as astronomy, mathematics, geography, medicine, literary studies. Now, the presence of so many scholars seems to be closely connected with the establishment of the museum by the Ptolemaic dynasty, the first two people. And they individually recruited these various scholars, brought them there, gave them a place for research, conversation, free meals, and financial support. Fraser points out in a famous book that you can't really connect all the famous people with the museum. There just isn't any evidence, but it's probable that some of them were connected. Our main source of information early on is Strabo, the great geographer who was there for a while, and who describes what they had there: cloister, garden, an except with seating, had a dining room, is special, and he doesn't mention the library at all. So there are a couple of possibilities. One is that it was inside the museum, and therefore he didn't mention it, or it had already been destroyed by the Roman invasion. Can't tell what that is. It was dedicated to the cult worship of the Muses, the 9 divine female patrons of the arts. According to Fraser, it was only in Roman times that the museums became non-religious. The library, I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes. It's located, not clear, perhaps inside the museum, perhaps not clear. No descriptions of it early on at all. The goal of the library, the early goal, was to have on its shelves a copy of every book written in the Greek language. Later on, it goes for some other languages, some translation, but at the beginning, and most of its achievement has been in Greek. The goal for this copy was to accurately reflect what the original author had intended. They're very careful to produce, as best they can, good editions. Now, to achieve these goals, it was necessary to send out buyers all over the markets in the Greek world, picking up books, borrowing, copying, the borrowing went so far as they searched the ships in the port to see if they had any books they could copy. Now, it's extremely hard work of putting them all together, involved getting various versions of a book to get the best text possible. How successful were they? Now, some of the books had already disappeared from the Greek language, but of the others, remarkably successful. It's just an extraordinary achievement. Probably almost everything we have from Greek antiquity went through there and their editing process. Looks like almost everything. I gave one example that looks like it was a result, is the works of Plato. The oddity, we have every book ever published by Plato, and the text is in extraordinarily good condition, leading some to think that it was Alexandria's work, that they may have had the original from which they copied. When the books were acquired, they were kept in storehouses near the docks. That may be important on the burning. According to Galen, he talked about it, how they were labeled initially by provenance, where the book came from, who the previous owner was, and who had edited the text. Much time was spent in clarifying the history of the text, determining which of duplicates was the better, and producing the best text possible. Just as I say, extraordinarily great work there was achieved. In addition, there was a scriptorium where they copied and for repairing various things. We have a couple of pictures of the imaginary library. We look at a couple of those. Oh, this goes back. There's a watercolor I saw, very striking. I had difficulty with getting it on here, but I want to show a little bit about it, and I intend to give it earlier. Shows the city on this isthmus, the huge lake there. Most of it is gone now. The canal that comes over to the Nile. There was another one that went down to the other canal. Another one. Yeah, please. This is the main street. Somebody's imagining the crossroads. What it was like. You can see at the stadium cross over to the island there. The Pharos, the lighthouse, is not shown. And they give places here, but it's not very clear. This particular intersection is still understood where that is in present day. Next one, please. This is a picture imagining how it's imagined, but we have a lot of description of the lighthouse. It was the seventh wonder of the world, one of the seven. Sometimes you read in books that the library was a wonder of the world, but I don't think it was ever on the list. Though a lot of books mention it that way, but the lighthouse was. Okay, we'll go back. This is the city in Little More than Hill. No, I'm sorry, go forward. Okay, we will eventually go back to that. Next one. Okay, this is somebody's imagination of the library. Next one. Okay, we'll stop there on that one. Shows the library imagination and the scrolls up there. We'll just leave that. The format and shelving of the books we're talking about would not be a codex format. The books today are called the codex format, and it's as if you stacked up the pages and then bound them on the left. That is not its beginning. It's only by the end of the story, at the time of Hypatia, that this will become quite prominent, and it will appear in the form of leather pages, but not at this early time. They would all be in the form of a roll, a papyrus roll, flattened out, and the pages will be side by side and rolled up. If you're interested in etymologies, which I find very distracting, the Latin name of the roll is volumen. Roll indicating it's rolled up, and we get the word volume from it. But though the word we always apply it to the codex. Anyway, sometimes a single roll would contain several short works, sometimes by the same person, sometimes by different authors. Sometimes a single work would take more than one roll. And some have wondered why, if there's not a connection in Plato's Republic, it has 10 books. Somebody suggests maybe it was on 10 papyrus rolls or designed in that way. Each roll would have a label attached. I don't know, this picture gives an indication. You can see the labels on the end of the rolls. Now, if we assume that the catalogs published by Telemachos, or with an M, I think, not an N, in the 3rd century actually reflect the way the great library was organized, it would appear that the rolls were placed on shelves, first according to subject matter, and then alphabetically by author. The director of the library was ex officio a member of the museum, and frequently, very frequently, the director of the library was the tutor of the children of the royal family. Xenodotus, the first director of the library, was famous for producing good editions of the writings of Homer. Mention quickly some libraries other than the Great Library. The one I want to mention is the Serapeum, built in connection with the temple to the Greek god Serapis. The relationship of this library to the large library is simply not clear. Some think it was an annex of the original, the large library. Some think it held duplicate copies. Some think it was open to the public, whereas the Great Library was not open to the public. But it isn't known very well. This building will come up later. The disappearance of the Great Library, there are many stories about it, and especially novels and movies and books about what happened to the library. And the story depends, who do you want to blame? But as listed here, the main steps, it looks like, in the destruction or disappearance of the library. The first one mentioned by Plutarch was the fire of 48 BCE. Caesar had pursued Pompey to Alexandria and set fire to the Ptolemaic ships in the eastern harbor. This led to the destruction of a lot of the warehouses along the docks And the fire spread and destroyed, in the words of Plutarch, the great book collection. Now, a lot of debate over what he meant and in what sense is it true, really. It's just very hard. One of the best arguments, I thought, it's an argument from silence, that if Julius Caesar had really destroyed the great library and Cicero knew about it, he would have written it up. And so it would be very, very good evidence. But there isn't. He doesn't mention it. Another step, Anthony, coming after Hitler, after Caesar, Julius Caesar had started a fire there. He made a gift, according to one document, of a couple 100,000 rolls that he'd stolen taken from Berkeley. No way to tell whether that's true, but it might indicate that Caesar had destroyed a lot of books. Augustus Caesar in 12 BC built some sort of a library dedicated to Julius Caesar. Emperor Dracula in 215 withdrew all funding from the museum and its members. It's assumed that that's the beginning of the end, that the scholars without their stipends didn't stay and produce in the same way. In 272, during the capture of Alexandria, the royal quarter was almost completely destroyed. And almost probably the library and the museum were destroyed, the buildings anyway. Some think that a lot of the books transferred to the Serapeum. Maybe go back to that map of the so the suggestion is that when the area up here, the royal area was destroyed, that many of the books were brought down here. But again, not very clear at all about what's happening. In 295, Diocletian sacked Alexandria, and it's mentioned that he destroyed a lot of the private libraries. And so many scholars, but not all, tend to regard 295 as the last point of the museum and great library. Number 7, Emperor Theodosius I in 391. I mentioned that in the 4th century, from Constantine or before to Theodosius, the Christian church, which had previously been persecuted, came to be tolerated and then became the established religion of the empire. In 391, Theodosius forbade all Christian rituals, and that's the beginning of much of the destruction of not only the ending of the cults, but the destruction of the temples themselves, many of them are beautiful buildings. One major event in 391, a Christian mob, having received the approval of Theodosius, completely destroyed the Serapeum. Now, apparently no ancient description of this event mentions any books being burned, and being present at the time. One of the sources mentioned there had been books there. So it's very, if you see the movie Agra, which I hope you do, a recent movie about Hypatia, they'll have the destruction of the Serapeum shown in great detail, and of course centers around the destruction of the books, which becomes a motivation. But apparently there's no real evidence that there were any books there still at that time. And there's no evidence that she was present or any of her students were present. The next, what is it, number 11 slide. That's it. This is what the Serapeum looks like today. And it's just a destroyed area there. Apparently a church was built after that, after the destruction of the original temple. This is all that's left today. Well, the picture would be much it's not bigger. Near the great pillar that still stands next to it. There are a couple of rooms there that looks like they may have been used for books. They have the shelves, but it's very, very unclear. It's destroyed, it looks like, as part of the anti-pagan activity of the Christians, the Christian mob. The leader of the Christians at this time, Theophilus, he's the uncle of the man coming up, Cyril. There's somebody I was reading once that if they ever make Theophilus a saint, he's going to put him in for the patron saint of arsonists. I mentioned at the end, number 8, the arrival of the Muslims. The Muslims, oddly enough, got blamed for burning the library, and there wasn't anything there when they got there in 640. And they're just simply have nothing to do with it. I mentioned they play a significant, they're not anti-intellectual especially, and play a huge part in preserving ancient Greek writings. And it's through them that the Greek writings mostly came to 12th and 13th century Europe. And within a few centuries, the Arabs would found the first great university, Al-Azhar, still in operation, but they found that in Cairo, not in Alexandria. Let me mention quickly the two of the communities there. They're important. This is where my direct interest was at one time, especially. First of all, the Jewish community in Alexandria, and then the Christian community. The Jewish community in Alexandria was huge, several 100,000. You had various estimates. Some of these numbers are hard to deal with. I didn't mention at the time of the library. The great library is often said to have had 500,000 or 700,000 rolls, but I noticed some of the later scholars seem to be thinking, well, they could believe 40,000, that makes some sense. But it's hard here to get a sense of just how large. Apparently we're 20% or more of the city of Alexandria were Jewish. It's the first great intellectual center of the diaspora. There were others later. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, were translated here at the request of one of the Ptolemies. And this translation has a special connection with it. I mentioned a couple of things there. Besides the very influential Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which makes it accessible to the world, Philo of Alexandria, really great intellectual. He's responsible for a couple of things. One, he's the first major person on introducing allegorical interpretation. That is the reading of the Bible in non-literal language, which gives great freedom for philosophers who want to use it. So besides teaching, interpreting the Bible in allegorical terms, he's also influential for picking up Greek ideas and passing them on. Most of his influence is on the Christians. I'll go quickly through the Christian community. Early Christianity, there was a strong anti-intellectual strain found in Tertullian and others. But there was also an intellectual strain. It was mainly in Alexandria that there first appears among Christians a great emphasis on education and the intellectual life. There was an attempt to produce a synthesis of Christian doctrine and Greek philosophy. And this becomes very prominent in Christian thought until you have, in the Middle Ages, the great summas, which combine in a single synthesis Greek doctrine with Christian doctrine. I picked out 2 examples to show the influence from Alexandria, which played such a large role. One of them is that this is mostly adopted under the influence of Philo. One, the dualistic doctrine that humans are composed of a material, mortal body and a spiritual, immortal soul. This is very radical, and it becomes the basic doctrine. Prior to that, Christians normally talk in terms of resurrection, not in terms of immortality, so, which will dominate it to the point that resurrection is far less prominent in the doctrine and not clearly what its rationale is. The second doctrine I picked out is something I worked on for many years, tracing ideas of thought through the Middle Ages. Philo took from the Stoics, the primary purpose of marriage and marital intercourse is the procreation of children. This doctrine led to the condemnation of contraception, and it became so embedded within Christian thought, the first Christian denomination to reject it were the Anglicans in 1930 at the Lambeth Conference. And the other denominations started to drop it mostly in the 30s and 1940s. Had an enormous influence and held by many Christians still. I mentioned at the end of the Christian, at the beginning of the 5th century, the Patriarch of Alexandria came to possess a lot of political power, and that's the background of the power came increasingly to be exercised against pagan temples, especially by his uncle, against the Jews, which is a very serious problem, and perhaps especially against fellow Christians. He was after heretics all the time. And the heretics, if he didn't think quite the way the Orthodox do, he got into trouble. Some say that that St. Cyril is the source of an expression that had later become famous in the 1960s, I think it was, even got into a movie called Cool Hand Luke. He's supposed to have said, what we have here is a failure to excommunicate. No, don't know if that's true. Finally, Hypatia, or Hypatia. Anyone who gives a talk on Hypatia has to be aware of a couple of things. Anybody in the audience who's ever heard of her is almost undoubtedly familiar with her in terms of a story that goes back to Voltaire and Gibbon, in The Fault Lies and Fall of the Roman Empire. And the second aspect you should keep in mind, the documentary evidence doesn't allow to give a lot of information with complete certainty. It's just not that. However, it's not hopeless. There are a number of things that can be known with relative probability. She's born in Alexandria about 355, was about 60 years old when she was murdered. One of the reviewers I read about the movie Agra, which stars Rachel Weisz as just beautiful, said that really should have been played by Helen Mirren. She's a little too beautiful for what Patty would have been in the 60s, but who knows. Much of her education from her father, Theon, who is quite well known for his work in mathematics and astronomy, editing works, the Euclid's Elements, the one that we have today. Until the 19th century, it was his edition was the one we have. Only in the 19th century, when they got an earlier edition, we were able to tell how many changes he actually made to it to make it, he thought, much easier. And in mathematics, Ptolemy's Almagest, he edited. With regard to knowledge of Hypatia, there's a good deal of writing in recent years by mathematicians, historians, showing more and more evidence that she participated in that work and that she even edited some of the work of Ptolemy. And there's some very interesting writings on that. Now, they're almost all quite recent. With regard to philosophy, we know that she taught courses on Plato and Aristotle, but we don't know about much of what she really taught, specific doctrine. Certainly deeply influenced by Plato. The emphasis on intellectual life and moral integrity, it becomes very, very clear. A lot of what we know about her comes from one of her students, Synesius. And he and his brother both became Christian bishops. Her students were often Christians as well as non-Christians. And the letters he's left her behind show her as just, I don't know, but not idolized, but something like that by her students. The attachment to her was enormous. And the lives that were tried to model on hers. She also gave public lectures in civil society. She was connected. A lot of the people government. Orestes, the prefect, he shows up in the movie, but wrongly as one of her early students. He'd come there as the Roman governor just a little before her death. She's a religious person, but she was not a Christian, not a Jew, and not attracted to polytheism. Very Platonic in her religious views, it looks like. Finally, the death of Hypatia. A key date of her death was when it was in October 412, when Patriarch Theophilus died and his nephew replaced him, a harsh authoritarian who spent a lot of time, besides chasing fellow Christians, a lot of time trying to get power from the civil authorities, and fairly successful. There are 4 or 5 documents that deal with the death of Hypatia. There's a new one, so I get you both one correct, that one, Hypatia, which for the most part tell roughly the same story. What I've done is attached here to the notes. The next page, the top of the next page, is a story of her death by Socrates. And it's a very good translation. And we have the translator here today, and all questions will be directed to him, if there are any. But a wonderful translation, and it's a very good picture of it. And in the end, he blames the Christians, the writer Socrates does. The background, however, especially in Socrates, he goes into the background and deals with the struggle between the Jews and the Christians. And the street gangs were very common in Alexandria, it looks like, often very religious. Anyway, the struggle developed back and forth. A lot of killings go on. And at one point, the prefect, Orestes, was wounded by one of the monks. His name was Ammonia. He hit Orestes with a rock. He was executed for it. He was declared a martyr by Cyril. The hostility between the two of them was very great, between Cyril and Orestes. Cyril objected strongly to the treatment of the Jews where they were driven out of Alexandria and their goods were stolen. Anyway, the Christians concluded that Hypatia, who advised Orestes, was the real problem. She stood in the way of reconciliation, and they dragged her, caught her coming home from summer, dragged her off her chariot, stripped her naked, took her to the Caesarea, that's now the cathedral, and killed her. Why was she murdered? It would appear that she was not murdered because she was a woman, or because she was a pagan, or because she was a philosopher, a Neoplatonist, an intellectual, or a very successful teacher. Certainly they're not the primary reason. The primary reason would seem to be the fact that she was seen as a friend and advisor to Orestes, and one whose advice prevented him from reconciling with Cyril in the struggle of how Alexandria should be governed. In other words, the death of Hypatia seems to be primarily a political murder, though that's not what's used. We're going to turn to the very last slide. Well, that might stop, but this is the beautiful This is the new library in Alexandria. It's, maybe go back. Yeah, there it is. This one here, the outside of the library has carved into it all the alphabets in the world. Now they want to reproduce the old library. And it goes show a couple of pictures. There it's across the water. You can get a picture. It slopes down. That's the reading room sloping down, go below water. Okay. This is the reading room in the Spanish. This is the sloping. It's really quite spectacular to see. Another one of the slope. It's like a disc on its side. Okay. This is a view of it at night, right alongside the ocean. Then finally, a picture of Rachel Weisz playing Hypatia in the movie. Anyway, I mentioned, given a few articles or books here that you might read. There's lots and lots more. And the movie is well worth it. It's filled with minor historical errors. It's fiction. And there are a couple of serious ones. But I guess I started to make up a list of it. I started to realize that most aren't that bad. And in fact, I got the impression that it's amazing how much they did get right. It's an amazing amount of information about her. It's quite accurate. They're off on Orestes. He wasn't one of her students. He didn't fall in love with her as one of her students, though all the others did, apparently. Anyway, it's well worth seeing the movie, accurate. Anyway, I've gone on way, way too long. And so let's start there. Don't ask me where I got those dates in Alexandria or my pronunciation of Greek words. Yes.
I saw the movie and I really enjoyed it. I'd recommend everybody see it. One of the things that occurred to me, I was reading Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy, and he conducts a dialogue in that book with what he calls Lady Philosophy.
Yes.
You mentioned the muses earlier in your talk. I was wondering whether or not you think it might have been Hypatia, or was it just a muse that was created for his muse?
When I read it, I never thought of that. I'm going back and
it occurred to me.
I did like
the movie.
The way it was Lady Philosophy.
Yeah.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
I'm not aware, just how aware he was of historical.
Okay.
Anyway, I recommend the movie. It's really, everybody has their own door, their own ox they won't want to go. One bothered me in the movie was Synesius, the one who wrote to her so much, such a source. Anyway, in the end, he collapses and tries to get her to cave in. It's just inconceivable that he would have done that. He admired her so much. For two reasons. One, he admired her immensely, and secondly, he'd been dead for 2 years. But movies, but it's well worth it. Yes.
One more point is that on the DVD, there's an excellent documentary on the city, Alexandria.
Oh.
So that's an extra good feature.
I don't think I've seen it.
Okay.
Yes.
So were you at Alexandria? Are those your photos, or?
They're not my photos. Ours, Martha and I, she's our photographer here. We were in Alexandria 3 years ago, I guess it was. And, but anyway, they're not.
So you've been there.
Oh yes, we've gone through the library and.
Why did they decide to recreate it?
Oh, they're really proud. To be the location of the greatest library in history.
But you don't know what the immediate.
I've read a lot of this stuff, but it was to restore Alexandria in many ways. Oh, they want to turn it into the greatest library. They even talked about getting all the books in the world, but it's not practical. I forgot the details. I read a lot about it and the ambition. But it is, some of the pictures don't bring out the incredible beauty of it, of the slanting disc for the reading room. It is just glorious.
So they, I guess, though they had the idea of recreating it for a long time, but just.
Yes, 2002 it opened.
Okay.
been building it before then. Yes, Jim.
You said you made the point that the Arabs established the oldest university soon after they...
3 centuries or so.
Did they have a book collection in Alexandria, the Arabs, or was there a university there? Or?
No, nothing special that I know of. But they just aren't the anti-book people. And of course, my main area is medieval thought. And they're the source of almost all the books in the 12th and 13th century. Aristotle. It's very fascinating to watch the translation. They came through Spain, which was occupied by the Arabs. And the translator almost always took 2 translators to go from the Arabic to a dialect such as Catalan, and that was done by a Jewish rabbi, almost always, not all. And the translation from the dialect to Latin was done by a Christian priest. So we are, in many cases, it's 2 people are known as the translators. But it's the role of thought coming to Western Europe. The Arabs are just very important. Also, I might mention that in terms of the treatment of Jews in Western Europe, the Middle Ages, the best treatment was in Spain under the Arabs, though it collapsed in the end in the 12th, 13th century. But it's where they were treated the best. Among the Christians, only a couple of it, Charlemagne's court. They're not badly treated there at all, but otherwise, pretty well. But the Arabs are somehow looked down upon. They're just major sources of knowledge for Western Europe. We've got paper from them. When paper came from China, it came through Spain. And they were using paper that slowly worked its way up through medieval Europe. The use of paper was really cheap. Whereas the old papyrus has problems and it doesn't last, and the leather is much more expensive. About the time of Hypatia, this is about the time that books start being moved from papyrus rolls to manuscripts on leather and in the codex form as well. And it's just about the time. A lot of the early writings were after 400. So, no, can't see it. Oh, Jack.
Don, you say on page 6, we have a somewhat limited knowledge of specific doctrines she held, deeply influenced by Plato. I wonder if you could elaborate upon a somewhat limited knowledge of specific doctrines. Do we know?
Which ones?
You say,
Platonic doctrines?
yeah, a somewhat limited knowledge of specific doctrines.
No, we don't know that. We know she's enthusiastic about Plato, just as Caesar. So you get the impression from her students what they say. But the doctrine of the immortal soul, the superiority of intellect, the playing down of the body, playing down of physical beauty, intellectual, spiritual beauty, enormous emphasis on intellectual, rational things, and integrity, moral integrity. But it's a little hard to get very specific. Anything connected with the spiritual soul, that's almost John Rist wrote an article a long while ago trying to pick out some of these, but it's really hard. He doesn't think Plotinus plays as big a role in her, but it's so hard after a while to tell. And so I was going mainly by Synesius and just sort of giving a feeling of, but the adulation of the students, what we all dream of. I've said so many good things about it. I should mention one thing, not quite so good, very much an aristocrat. She and all her students were aristocrats. This isn't the poor in there spending the years just yes.
Do you know any artists' renderings of Hypatia?
Oh, there are some, yes. I have one of them. I think the best bet is the internet. You'll pick up. That's where you'll find an awful lot. One of the best things on the movie that I found very interesting, Martha found me a lot of the movie reviews. So I spent quite an amazing amount of time reading reviews and the fights between them, and especially over historical accuracy And some of the scientists were annoyed. Come on, she didn't predict the movement of the Earth around the sun in ellipses. And they had a big argument back. One said she couldn't have thought of it. The other one showed, no, there's certain things she certainly knew Aristarchus well. And so you get wonderful arguments back and forth on mistakes. But that was where the pictures of her. But this is my favorite. She's a wonderful actress. One of my former students.
This has been wonderful, John, and we have a little...
I hope I wasn't too short.
Well, I'm going to invite people to stay on, but in the meantime, we have a little token of appreciation on behalf of everyone here today. You may have noticed we're videotaping this talk, so we look forward to people enjoying the talk in the future as well. Thank you so much.